Hello there, your imaginary friend. I have another story for you. This one is another by John Buchan. Now, as always, bear in mind that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that at the time of writing seemed fine to them, and it's not always fine. This is called The Wind in the Portico, Henry Nightingale's story, and it is introduced by Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 11 to 12. A dry wind of the high places, not to fan nor to cleanse, even a full wind from those places shall come unto me. Nightingale was a hard man to draw. His doings with the Bedouin had become a legend, but he would as soon have talked about them as claimed to have won the war. He was a slim, dark fellow, about 35 years of age, very short-sighted, and wearing such high-powered double glasses that it was impossible to tell the color of his eyes. This weakness made him stoop a little and peer, so that he was the strangest figure to picture in a burnous leading an army of desert tribesmen. I fancy his power came partly from his oddness, for his followers thought that the hand of Allah had been laid on him, and partly from his quick imagination and his flawless courage. After the war, he had gone back to his Cambridge fellowship, declaring that, thank God, that chapter in his life was over. As I say, he never mentioned the deeds which had made him famous. He knew his own business, and probably realized that to keep his mental balance, he had to drop the curtain on what must have been the most nerve-wracking 4 years ever spent by man. We respected his decision, and kept off Arabia. It was a remark of Henne's that drew from him the following story. Henne was talking about his Cotswold house, which was on the Fosse Way, and saying that it always puzzled him how so elaborate a civilization as Roman Britain could have been destroyed utterly and left no mark on the national history beyond a few roads and ruins and place names. Peckweather, the historian, demurred and had a good deal to say about how much the Roman tradition was woven into the Saxon culture. "Rome only sleeps," he said. "She never dies." Nightingale nodded. "Sometimes she dreams in her sleep and talks. Once she scared me out of my senses." After a good deal of pressing, he produced this story. He was not much of a talker, so he wrote it out and read it to us. There's a place in Shropshire which I do not propose to visit again. It lies between Ludlow and the hills in a shallow valley made of woods. Its name is St. Sant, a village with a big house and park adjoining on a stream called the Vaughan, about 5 miles from the little town of Faxeter. They have queer names in those parts, and other things queerer than the names. I was motoring from Wales to Cambridge at the close of the long vacation. All this happened before the war, when I had just got my fellowship and was settling down to academic work. It was a fine night in early October, with a full moon, and I intended to push on to Ludlow for supper and bed. The time was about 8:30. The road was empty and good going, and I was trundling pleasantly along when something went wrong with my headlights. It was a small thing, and I stopped to remedy it beyond a village and just at the lodge gates of a house. On the opposite side of the road, a carrier's cart had drawn up, and 2 men who looked like indoor servants were lifting some packages from it onto a big barrow. The moon was up, so I didn't need the feeble light of the carrier's lamp to see what they were doing. I suppose I wanted to stretch my legs for a moment, for when I had finished my job, I strolled over to them. They did not hear me coming, and the carrier on his perch seemed to be asleep. The packages were the ordinary consignments from some big shop in town, but I noticed that the 2 men handled them very gingerly, and that as each was laid in the barrow, they clipped off the shop label and affixed one of their own. The new labels were odd things, large and square, with some address written on them in very big black capital letters. There was nothing in that, but the men's faces puzzled me, for they seemed to do their job in a fever, longing to get it over, and yet in a sweat lest they should make some mistake. Their commonplace task seemed to be for them a matter of tremendous importance. I moved so as to get a view of their faces, and I saw that they were white and strained. The two were of the butler or valet class, both elderly, and I could have sworn that they were laboring under something like fear. I shuffled my feet to let them know of my presence, and remarked that it was a fine night. They started as if they'd been robbing a corpse. One of them mumbled something in reply, but the other caught a package which was slipping, and in a tone of violent alarm growled to his mate to be careful. I had a notion that they were handling explosives. I had no time to waste, so I pushed on. That night, in my room at Ludlow, I had the curiosity to look up my map and identify the place where I had seen the men. The village was St. Sant, and it appeared that the gate I had stopped at belonged to a considerable domain called Vaughan Castle. That was my first visit. At that time I was busy on a critical edition of Theocritus, for which I was making a new collation of the manuscripts. There was a variant of the Medician Codex in England, which nobody had seen since Gaisford, and after a good deal of trouble I found that it was in the library of a man called Duboulay. I wrote to him at his London club, and got a reply to my surprise from Vaughan Castle Hall, Faxeter. It was an odd letter, for you could see that he longed to tell me to go to the devil, but couldn't quite reconcile it with his conscience. We exchanged several letters, and the upshot was that he gave me permission to examine his manuscript. He did not ask me to stay, but mentioned that there was a comfortable little inn in St. Sant. My second visit began on the 27th of December, after I had been home for Christmas. We had had a week of severe frost, and then it had thawed a little, but it remained bitterly cold, with leaden skies that threatened snow. I drove from Faxeter, and as we ascended the valley, I remember thinking that it was a curiously sad country. The hills were too low to be impressive, and their outlines were mostly blurred with woods, but the tops showed clear, funny little knolls of gray bent that suggested a volcanic origin. It might have been one of those backgrounds you find in Italian primitives, with all the light and color left out. When I got a glimpse of the Vaughan and the bleached meadows, it looked like the wan water of the border ballads. The woods, too, had not the friendly bareness of English copses in winter-time. They remained dark and cloudy, as if they were hiding secrets. Before I reached St. Sant, I decided that the landscape was not only sad, but ominous. I was fortunate in my inn. In the single street of one-storied cottages, it rose like a lighthouse, with a cheery glow from behind the red curtains of the bar parlour. The inside proved as good as the outside. I found a bedroom with a bright fire, and I dined in a wainscoted room full of preposterous old pictures of lanky hounds and hollow-backed horses. I had been rather depressed on my journey, but my spirits were raised by this comfort, and when the house produced a most respectable bottle of port, I had the landlord in to drink a glass. He was an ancient man who had been a gamekeeper, with a much younger wife who was responsible for the management. I was curious to hear something about the owner of my manuscript, but I got little from the landlord. He'd been with the old squire and had never served the present one. I heard of Duboulay's in plenty, the landlord's master, who had hunted his own hounds for 40 years, the Major, his brother, who had fallen at Abu Klea, Parson Jack, who had had the living till he died, and of all kinds of collaterals. The Deblays had been a high-spirited, open-handed stock, and much liked in the place. But of the present master of the hall, he could or would tell me nothing. The squire was a great scholard, but I gathered that he followed no sport, and was not a convivial soul, like his predecessors. He'd spent a mint of money on the house, but not many people went there. He, the landlord, had never been inside the grounds in the new master's time, though in the old days there had been hunt breakfasts on the lawn for the whole countryside, and mighty tenantry dinners. I went to bed with a clear picture in my mind of the man I was to interview on the morrow, a scholarly and autocratic recluse, who collected treasures and beautified his dwelling, and probably lived in his library. I rather looked forward to meeting him, for the Bonhummus sporting squire was not much in my line. After breakfast next morning, I made my way to the hall. It was the same leaden weather, and when I entered the gates, the air seemed to grow bitterer, and the skies darker. The place was muffled in great trees, which even in their winter barrenness made a pall about it. There was a long avenue of ancient sycamores through which one caught only rare glimpses of the frozen park. I took my bearings and realized that I was walking nearly due south and was gradually descending. The house must be in a hollow. Presently the trees thinned, and I passed through an iron gate, came out on a big untended lawn, untidily studded with laurels and rhododendrons. And there before me was the house front. I'd expected something beautiful, an old Tudor or Queen Anne facade or a dignified Georgian portico. I was disappointed, for the front was simply mean. It was low and irregular, more like the back parts of a house, and I guessed that at some time or another the building had been turned round and the old kitchen door made the chief entrance. I was confirmed in my conclusion by observing that the roof rose in tiers, like one of those recessed New York skyscrapers, so that the present back parts of the building were of an impressive height. The oddity of the place interested me, and still more its dilapidation. What on earth could the owner have spent his money on? Everything, lawn, flower beds, paths, was neglected. There was a new stone doorway, but the walls badly needed pointing. The window woodwork had not been painted for ages. There were several broken panes. The bell did not ring, so I was reduced to hammering on the knocker, and it must have been 10 minutes before the door opened. A pale butler, one of the men I had seen at the carrier's cart the October before, stood blinking in the entrance. He led me in without question when I gave my name, so I was evidently expected. The hall was my second surprise. What had become of my picture of the collector? The place was small and poky and furnished as barely as the lobby of a farmhouse. The only thing I approved was its warmth. Unlike most English country houses, there seemed to be excellent heating arrangements. I was taken into a little dark room with one window that looked out on a shrubbery, while the man went to fetch his master. My chief feeling was of gratitude that I had not been asked to stay, for the inn was paradise compared with this sepulchre. I was examining the prints on the wall when I heard my name spoken and turned round to greet Mr. Doublet. He was my third surprise. I had made a portrait in my mind of a fastidious old scholar with eyeglasses on a black cord and a finical, Weltkindish manner. Instead, I found a man still in early middle age, a heavy fellow dressed in the roughest country tweeds. He was as untidy as his domain, for he had not shaved that morning. His flannel collar was badly frayed, and his fingernails would have been the better for a scrubbing brush. His face was hard to describe. It was high-colored, but the color was not healthy. It was friendly, but it was also wary. Above all, it was unquiet. He gave me the impression of a man whose nerves were all wrong and who was perpetually on his guard. He said a few civil words and thrust a badly tied brown paper parcel at me. "That's your manuscript," he said jauntily. I was staggered. I had expected to be permitted to collate the codex in his library, and in the last few minutes had realized that the prospect was distasteful. But here was this casual owner offering me the priceless thing to take away. I stammered my thanks, and added that it was very good of him to trust a stranger with such a treasure. "Only as far as the inn," he said. "I wouldn't like to send it by post, but there's no harm in your working at it at the inn. There should be confidence among scholars." And he gave an odd cackle of a laugh. "I greatly prefer your plan," I said, "but I thought you would insist on my working at it here." "Oh, indeed," he said earnestly. "I shouldn't think of such a thing. I wouldn't do it all. An insult to our Freemasonry. That's how I should regard it." We had a few minutes' further talk. I learned that he had inherited under the entail from a cousin, and had been just over 10 years at Vaughan Castle. Before that, he had been a London solicitor. He asked me a question or two about Cambridge. wished he had been at the university, much hampered in his work by a defective education. I was a Greek scholar. Latin, too, he presumed. Wonderful people, the Romans. He spoke quite freely, but all the time his queer, restless eyes were darting about, and I had a strong impression that he would have liked to say something to me very different from these commonplaces, that he was longing to broach some subject, but was held back by shyness or fear. He had such an odd, appraising way of looking at me. I left without his having asked me to a meal, for which I was not sorry, for I did not like the atmosphere of the place. I took a short cut over the ragged lawn and turned at the top of the slope to look back. The house was in reality a huge pile, and I saw that I had been right and that the main building was all at the back. Was it, I wondered, like the Alhambra, which, behind a front like a factory, concealed a treasure house? I saw, too, that the woodland hollow was more spacious than I had fancied. The house was, as at present arranged, faced due north, and behind the south front was an open space in which I guessed that a lake might lie. Far beyond I could see, in the December dimness, the lift of high dark hills. That evening the snow came in earnest, and fell continuously for the better part of 2 days. I banked up the fire in my bedroom and spent a happy time with the codex. I had brought only my working books with me, and the inn boasted no library, so when I wanted to relax I went down to the tap room, or gossiped with the landlady in the bar parlour. The yokels who congregated in the former were pleasant fellows, but like all the folk on the marches, they did not talk readily to a stranger, and I heard little from them of the hall. The old squire had reared every year 3,000 pheasants, but the present squire would not allow a gun to be fired on his land, and there were only a few wild birds left. For the same reason, the woods were thick with vermin. This they told me when I professed an interest in shooting. But of Mr. de Belay they would not speak, declaring that they never saw him. I dare say they gossiped wildly about him, and their public reticence struck me as having in it a touch of fear. The landlady, who came from a different part of the shire, was more communicative. She had not known the former de Belays, and so had no standard of comparison, but she was inclined to regard the present squire as not quite right in the head. "They do say," she would begin, but she too suffered from some inhibition, and what promised to be sensational would tail off into the commonplace. One thing apparently puzzled the neighborhood above all others, and that was his rearrangement of the house. "They do say," she said in an awed voice, "that he have built a great church." She had never visited it. No one in the parish had, for Squire de Belay did not allow intruders. But from Lynn Hill you could see it through a gap in the woods. "He's no good Christian," she told me, "and him and Vicar has quarrelled this many a day. But they do say as he worships summat there." I learned that there were no women servants in the house, but only the men he had brought from London. "Poor benighted souls, they must live in a sad hovel," said the buxom lady, shrugged her shoulders, and giggled. On the last day of December I decided that I needed exercise and must go for a long stride. The snow had ceased that morning, and the dull skies had changed to a clear blue. It was still very cold, but the sun was shining, the snow was firm and crisp underfoot, and I proposed to survey the country. So after luncheon I put on thick boots and gaiters and made for Lynn Hill. This meant a considerable circuit, for the place lay south of the Vaughan Castle Park. From it I hoped to get a better view of the other side of the house. I was not disappointed. There was a rift in the thick woodlands, and below me, 2 miles off, I suddenly saw a strange building like a classical temple. Only the entablature and the tops of the pillars showed above the trees, but they stood out, vivid and dark against the background of snow. The spectacle of that in that lonely place was so startling that for a little I could only stare. I remember that I glanced behind me to the snowy line of the Welsh mountains, and felt that I might have been looking at a winter view of the Apennines 2,000 years ago. My curiosity was now alert, and I determined to get a nearer view of this marvel. I left the track and ploughed through the snowy fields down to the skirts of the woods. After that, my troubles began. I found myself in a very good imitation of a primeval forest, where the undergrowth had been unchecked and the rides uncut for years. I sank into deep pits. I was savagely torn by briars and brambles, but I struggled on, keeping a line as best I could. At last the trees stopped. Before me was a flat expanse, which I knew must be a lake, and beyond rose the temple. It ran the whole length of the house, and from where I stood it was hard to believe that there were buildings at its back where men dwelt. It was a fine piece of work. The first glance told me that. Admirably proportioned, classical, yet not following exactly any of the classical models. One could imagine a great echoing interior, dim with the smoke of sacrifice, and it was only by reflecting that I realized that the peristyle could not be continued down the two sides, that there was no interior, and that what I was looking at was only a portico. The thing was at once impressive and preposterous. What madness had been in Doublet when he embellished his house with such a grandiose garden front? The sun was setting, and the shadow of the wooded hills darkened the interior, so I could not even make out the back wall of the porch. I wanted a nearer view, so I embarked on the frozen lake. Then I had an odd experience. I was not tired. The snow lay level and firm, but I was conscious of extreme weariness. The biting air had become warm and oppressive. I had to drag boots that seemed to weigh tons across that lake. The place was utterly silent in the stricture of the frost, and from the pile in front, no sign of life came. I reached the other side at last and found myself in a frozen shallow of bulrushes and skeleton willow herbs. They were taller than my head, and to see the house I had to look upward through their snowy traceries. It was perhaps 80 feet above me and 100 yards distance, and since I was below it, the delicate pillars seemed to spring to a great height. But it was still dusky, and the only detail I could see was on the ceiling, which seemed either to be carved or painted with deeply shaded monochrome figures. Suddenly the dying sun came slanting through the gap in the hills, and for an instant the whole portico to its farthest recesses was washed in clear gold and scarlet. That was wonderful enough. But there was something more. The air was utterly still, with not the faintest breath of wind, so still that when I had lit a cigarette half an hour before, the flame of the match had burned steadily upward, like a candle in a room. As I stood among the sedges, not a single frost crystal stirred. But there was a wind blowing in the portico. I could see it lifting feathers of snow from the base of the pillars and fluffing the cornices. The floor had already been swept clean, but tiny flakes drifted onto it from the exposed edges. The interior was filled with a furious movement, though a yard from it was frozen peace. I felt nothing of the action of the wind, but I knew that it was hot as the breath of a furnace. I had only one thought, dread of being overtaken by night near that place. I turned and ran with laboring steps across the lake, panting and stifling with a deadly hot oppression, ran blindly by a sort of instinct in the direction of the village. I did not stop till I had wrested through the big wood and come out on some rough pasture above the highway. Then I dropped on the ground and felt again the comforting chill of the December air. The adventure left me in an uncomfortable mood. I was ashamed of myself for playing the fool, and at the same time hopelessly puzzled, for the oftener I went over in my mind the incidents of the afternoon, the more I was at a loss for an explanation. One feeling was uppermost, that I did not like this place and wanted to be out of it. I had already broken the back of my task, and by shutting myself up for 2 days I completed it. That is to say, I made my collation as far as I had advanced myself in my commentary on the text. I did not want to go back to the hall, so I wrote a civil note to Doublet expressing my gratitude and saying that I was sending up the manuscript by the landlord's son, as I scrupled to trouble him with another visit. I got a reply at once saying that Mr. Doublet would liked to give himself the pleasure of dining with me at the inn before I went, and would receive the manuscript in person. It was the last night of my stay at St. Saint, so I ordered the best dinner the place could provide, and a magnum of claret, of which I discovered a bin in the cellar. Duboulay appeared promptly at 8 o'clock, arriving, to my surprise, in a car. He had tidied himself up and put on a dinner jacket, and he looked exactly like the city solicitors you see dining in the Junior Carlton. He was in excellent spirits, and his eyes had lost their air of being on guard. He seemed to have reached some conclusion about me, or decided that I was harmless. More, he seemed to be burning to talk to me. After my adventure, I was prepared to find fear in him, the fear I had seen in the faces of the men servants, but there was none. Instead, there was excitement, overpowering excitement. He neglected the courses in his verbosity. His coming to dinner had considerably startled the inn, and instead of a maid, the landlady herself waited on us. She seemed to want to get the meal over, and hustled the biscuits and the port onto the table as soon as she decently could. Then Duboulay became confidential. He was an enthusiast, it appeared, an enthusiast with a single hobby. All his life he had pottered among antiquities, and when he succeeded at Vaughan Castle he had the leisure and money to indulge himself. The place, it seemed, had been famous in Roman Britain, Vaughan Castra, and Faxeter was a corruption of the same. Who was Vaunus? I asked. He grinned and told me to wait. There had been an old temple up in the high woods. There had always been a local legend about it, and the place was supposed to be haunted. Well, he had had the site excavated, and he had found— here he became the cautious solicitor, and explained to me the law of treasure trove. As long as the objects found were not intrinsically valuable, not gold or jewels, the finder was entitled to keep them. He had done so. Had not published the results of his excavations in the proceedings of any learned society, did not want to be bothered by tourists. I was different, for I was a scholar. What had he found? It was really rather hard to follow his babbling talk, but I gathered that he had found certain carvings and sacrificial implements. And, he sunk his voice, most important of all, an altar of Vaunus, the tutelary deity of the Vale. When he mentioned this word, his face took on a new look, not of fear, but of secrecy, a kind of secret excitement. I'd seen the same look on the face of a street-preaching Salvationist. Vaunus had been a British god of the hills, whom the Romans, in their liberal way, appear to have identified with Apollo. He gave me a long, confused account of him, from which it appeared that Mr. Duboulay was not an exact scholar. Some of his derivations of place names were absurd, like Saint Sant from Sancta Sanctorum, and in quoting a line of Ausonius, he made 2 false quantities. He seemed to hope that I could tell him something more about Vaunus, but I said that my subject was Greek and that I was deeply ignorant about Roman Britain. I mentioned several books and found that he had never heard of Haverfield. One word he used, hypocaust, which suddenly gave me a clue. He must have heated the temple, as he heated his house, by some very efficient system of hot air. I know little about science, but I imagined that the artificial heat of the portico, as contrasted with the cold outside, might create an air current. At any rate, that explanation satisfied me, and my afternoon's adventure lost its uncanniness. The reaction made me feel friendly towards him, and I listened to his talk with sympathy, but I decided not to mention that I had visited his temple. He told me about it himself in the most open way. I couldn't leave the altar on the hillside, he said. I had to make a place for it, so I turned the old front of the house into a sort of temple. I got the best advice, but architects are ignorant people, and I often wished I'd been a better scholar. Still, the place satisfies me. I hope it satisfies Vaunus, I said jocularly. I think so, he replied quite seriously, and then his thoughts seemed to go wandering, and for a minute or so he looked through me with a queer abstraction in his eyes. What do you do with it now you've got it? I asked. He didn't reply. but smiled to himself. "I don't know if you remember a passage in Sidonius Apollinaris," I said, "a formula for consecrating pagan altars to Christian uses. You begin by sacrificing a white cock or something suitable, and tell Apollo with all friendliness that the old dedication is off for the present. Then you have a Christian invocation." He nearly jumped off his chair. "That wouldn't do. Wouldn't do at all. Oh, Lord, no. Couldn't think of it for one moment." It was as if I had offended his ears by some horrid blasphemy, and the odd thing was that he never recovered his composure. He tried, for he had good manners, but his ease and friendliness had gone. We talked stiffly for another half-hour about trifles, and then he rose to leave. I returned him his manuscript, neatly parcelled up and expanded in thanks, but he scarcely seemed to heed me. He stuck the thing in his pocket and departed with the same air of shocked absorption. After he had gone, I sat before the fire and reviewed the situation. I was satisfied with my hypocaust theory, and had no more perturbation in my memory about my afternoon's adventure. Yet a slight flavour of unpleasantness hung about it, and I felt that I did not quite like Du Bellay. I set him down as a crank, who had tangled himself up with a half-witted hobby, like an old maid with her cats, and I was not sorry to be leaving the place. My third and last visit to St. Saint was in the following June, the midsummer of 1914. I had all but finished my Theocritus, but I needed another day or two with the Vaughan Castle manuscript, and as I wanted to clear the whole thing off before I went to Italy in July, I wrote to Du Bellay and asked if I might have another sight of it. The thing was a bore, but it had to be faced, and I fancied that the valley would be a pleasant place in that hot summer. I got a reply at once, inviting, almost begging me to come, and insisting that I should stay at the hall. I couldn't very well refuse, though I would have preferred the inn. He wired about my train and wired again, saying he would meet me. This time I seemed to be a particularly welcome guest. I reached Faxeter in the evening, and was met by a car from a Faxeter garage. The driver was a talkative young man, and as the car was a closed one, I sat beside him for the sake of fresh air. The term had tired me, and I was glad to get out of stuffy Cambridge, but I cannot say that I found it much cooler as we ascended the Vaughan Valley. The woods were in their summer magnificence, but a little dulled and tarnished by the heat. The river was shrunk to a trickle, and the curious hilltops were so scorched by the sun that they seemed almost yellow above the green of the trees. Once again I had the feeling of a landscape fantastically un-English. "Squire Du Bellay has been in a great way about your coming, sir," the driver informed me. "Sent down 3 times to the boss to make sure it was all right. He's got a car of his own, too, a nice little Daimler, but he don't seem to use it much. I haven't seen him about in it for a month of Sundays." As we turned in at the hall gates, he looked curiously about him. "Never been here before, though I've been in most gentlemen's parks for 50 miles round. Rum old-fashioned spot, isn't it, sir?" If it had seemed a shuttered sanctuary in midwinter, in that June twilight it was more than ever a place enclosed and guarded. There was almost an autumn smell of decay, a dry decay, like touchwood. We seemed to be descending through layers of ever-thickening woods. When at last we turned through the iron gate, I saw that the lawns had reached a further stage of neglect, for they were as shaggy as a hayfield. The white-faced butler let me in, and there, waiting at his back, was Du Bellay. But he was not the man whom I had seen in December. He was dressed in an old baggy suit of flannels, and his unwholesome red face was painfully drawn and sunken. There were dark pouches under his eyes, and these eyes were no longer excited, but dull and pained. Yes, and there was more than pain in them. There was fear. I wondered if his hobby were becoming too much for him. He greeted me like a long-lost brother. Considering that I scarcely knew him, I was a little embarrassed by his warmth. "Bless you for coming, my dear fellow," he cried. "You want a wash, and then we'll have dinner. Don't bother to change unless you want to. I never do." He led me to my bedroom, which was clean enough, but small and shabby, like a servant's room. I guessed that he had gutted the house to build his absurd temple. We dined in a fair-sized room, which was a kind of library. It was lined with old books, but they did not look as if they had been there long. Rather, it seemed like a lumber room in which a fine collection had been stored. Once, no doubt, they had lived in a dignified Georgian chamber. There was nothing else, none of the antiques which I had expected. "You've come just in time," he told me. "I fairly jumped when I got your letter, for I had been thinking of running up to Cambridge to insist on your coming down here. I hope you're in no hurry to leave." "As it happens," I said, "I am rather pressed for time, for I hope to go abroad next week. I ought to finish my work here in a couple of days. I can't tell you how much I'm in your debt for your kindness." 2 days, he said. "That will get us over midsummer. That should be enough." I hadn't a notion what he meant. I told him that I was looking forward to examining his collection. He opened his eyes. "Your discoveries, I mean," I said. "The altar of Vaunus." As I spoke the words, his face suddenly contorted in a spasm of what looked like terror. He choked, and then recovered himself. "Yes, yes," he said rapidly. "You shall see it. You shall see everything, but not now, not tonight. Tomorrow, in broad daylight, that's the time." After that, the evening became a bad dream. Small talk deserted him, and he could only reply with an effort to my commonplaces. I caught him often looking at me furtively, as if he were sizing me up, and wondering how far he could go with me. The thing fairly got on my nerves, and to crown it all, it was abominably stuffy. The windows of the room gave on a little paved court with a background of laurels, and I might have been in 7 Dials for all the air there was. When coffee was served, I could stand it no longer. "What about smoking in the temple?" I said. "It should be cool there with the air from the lake." I might have been proposing the assassination of his mother. He simply gibbered at me. "Oh, no, no," he stammered. "My God, no." It was half an hour before he could properly collect himself. A servant lit 2 oil lamps, and we sat on in the frosty room. "You said something when we last met," he ventured at last, after many a sidelong glance at me. "Something about a ritual for rededicating an altar." I remembered my remark about Sidonius Apollinaris. "Could you show me the passage?" "There's a good classical library here, collected by my great-grandfather. Unfortunately, my scholarship is not equal to using it properly." I got up and hunted among the shelves, and presently found a copy of Sidonius, the Plantin edition of 1609. I turned up the passage and roughly translated it for him. He listened hungrily, and made me repeat it twice. "It says a cock," he hesitated. "Is it essential?" "I don't think so. I fancy any of the recognized ritual stuff would do." "I'm glad," he said simply. "I'm afraid of blood." "Good God, man," I cried out. "Are you taking my nonsense seriously? I was only chaffing. Let old Vaunus stick to his altar." He looked at me like a puzzled and rather offended dog. "Sidonius was in earnest." "Well, I'm not," I said rudely. "We're in the 20th century and not in the 3rd. Isn't it about time we went to bed?" He made no objection and found me a candle in the hall. As I undressed, I wondered into what kind of lunatic asylum I had strayed. I felt the strongest distaste for the place and longed to go straight off to the inn, only I couldn't make use of a man's manuscript and insult his hospitality. It was fairly clear to me that Dubillé was mad. He'd ridden his hobby to the death of his wits, and was now in its bondage. Good Lord! He talked of his precious Vaunus as a votary talks of a god. I believed he had come to worship some figment of his half-educated fancy. I think I must have slept for a couple of hours. Then I woke, dripping with perspiration, for the place was simply an oven. My window was as wide open as it would go, and though it was a warm night, when I stuck my head out, the air was fresh. The heat came from indoors. The room was on the first floor near the entrance, and I was looking on to the overgrown lawns. The night was very dark and utterly still, but I could have sworn that I heard wind. The trees were as motionless as marble, but somewhere close at hand I heard a strong gust blowing. Also, though there was no moon, there was somewhere near me a steady glow of light. I could see the reflection of it round the end of the house. That meant it came from the temple. What kind of Saturnalia was Dubélé conducting at such an hour? When I drew in my head, I felt that if I was to get any sleep, something must be done. There could be no question about it. Some fool had turned on the steam heat, for the room was a furnace. My temper was rising. There was no bell to be found, so I lit my candle and set out to find a servant. I tried to cast downstairs and discovered the room where we had dined. Then I explored a passage at right angles, which brought me up against a great oak door. The light showed me that it was a new door, and that there was no apparent way of opening it. I guessed that it led into the temple, and though it fitted close, and there seemed to be no keyhole, I could hear through it a sound like a rushing wind. Next I opened a door on my right and found myself in a big store cupboard. It had a funny, exotic, spicy smell, and arranged very neatly on the floor and shelves was a number of small sacks and coffers. Each bore a label, a square of stout paper with very black letterings. I read Pro Servitio Vani. I'd seen them before, for my memory betrayed me if they were not the very labels the Dubelé's servants had been attaching to the packages from the carrier's cart that evening in the past autumn. The discovery made my suspicions an unpleasant certainty. Dubélé evidently meant the labels to read for the service of Vaunus. He was no scholar, for it was an impossible use of the word servicium, but he was very patently a madman. However, it was my immediate business to find some way to sleep, so I continued my quest for a servant. I followed another corridor and discovered a second staircase. At the top of it I saw an open door and looked in. It must have been Dubelé's, for his flannels were tumbled untidily on a chair, but Dubélé himself was not there, and the bed had not been slept in. I suppose my irritation was greater than my alarm, though I must say I was getting a little scared, for I still pursued the evasive servant. There was another stair which apparently led to attics, and in going up it I slipped and made a great clatter. When I looked up, the butler in his nightgown was staring down at me, and if ever a mortal face held fear, it was his. When he saw who it was, he seemed to recover a little. "Look here," I said, "for God's sake turn off that infernal hot air. I can't get a wink of sleep. What idiot set it going?" He looked at me owlishly, but he managed to find his tongue. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said. "There is no heating apparatus in this house." There's nothing more to be said. I returned to my bedroom, and it seemed to me that it had grown cooler. As I leaned out of the window, too, the mysterious wind seemed to have died away, and the glow no longer showed from beyond the corner of the house. I got into bed and slept heavily till I was roused by the appearance of my shaving water at about 9:30. There was no bathroom, so I bathed in a tin pannikin. It was a hazy morning, which promised a day of blistering heat. When I went down to breakfast, I found Dubélé in the dining-room. In the daylight, he looked a very sick man, but he seemed to have taken a pull on himself, for his manner was considerably less nervy than the night before. Indeed, he appeared almost normal, and I might have reconsidered my view, but for the look in his eyes. I told him that I proposed to sit tight all day over the manuscript and get the thing finished. He nodded. "That's all right. I've a lot to do myself, and I won't disturb you." "But first," I said, "you promised to show me your discoveries." He looked at the window, where the sun was shining on the laurels and on a segment of the paved court. "The light is good," he said, an odd remark. "Let us go there now. There are times and seasons for the temple." He led me down the passage I had explored the previous night. The door opened not by a key, but some lever in the wall. I found myself looking suddenly at a bath of sunshine, with the lake below as blue as a turquoise. It was not easy to describe my impressions of that place. It was unbelievably light and airy, brilliant as an Italian colonnade in midsummer. The proportions must have been good, for the columns soared and swam, and the roof, which looked like cedar, floated as delicately as a flower on its stalk. The stone was some local limestone, which on the floor took a polish like marble. All around was a vista of sparkling water and summer woods and far blue mountains. It should have been as wholesome as the top of a hill. And yet, I had scarcely entered before I knew that it was a prison. I'm not an imaginative man, and I believe my nerves are fairly good, but I could scarcely put one foot before the other, so strong was my distaste. I felt shut off from the world, as if I were in a dungeon or on an ice floe, and I felt, too, that, though far enough from humanity, we were not alone. On the inner wall there were 3 carvings. 2 were imperfect friezes sculptured in low relief, dealing apparently with the same subject. It was a ritual procession, priests bearing branches, the ordinary dendrophori business. The faces were only half human, and that was from no lack of skill, for the artist had been a master. The striking thing was that the branches and the hair of the hierophants were being tossed by a violent wind, and the expression of each was as of a being in the last stage of endurance, shaken to the core by terror and pain. Between the friezes was a great roundel of a gorgon's head. It was not a female head, such as you might commonly find, but a male head, with the viperous hair sprouting from chin and lip. It had once been colored, and fragments of a green pigment remained in the locks. It was an awful thing, the ultimate horror of fear, the last dementia of cruelty made manifest in stone. I hurriedly averted my eyes and looked at the altar. That stood at the west end, on a pediment with 3 steps. It was a beautiful piece of work, scarcely harmed by the centuries, with 2 words inscribed on its face. Aphol Vaughan. It was made of some foreign marble, and the hollow top was dark with ancient sacrifices. Not so ancient either, for I could have sworn that I saw there the mark of recent flame. I do not suppose I was more than 5 minutes in the place. I wanted to get out, and Duboulay wanted me to get out. We did not speak a word till we were back in the library. "For God's sake, give it up," I said. "You're playing with fire, Mr. Duboulay. You're driving yourself into bedlam. Send these damn things to a museum, and leave this place. Now, I tell you. You have no time to lose. Come down with me to the inn, straight off, and shut up this house." He looked at me with his lip quivering like a child about to cry. "I will. I promise you I will, but not yet. After tonight. Tomorrow. I'll do whatever you tell me. You won't leave me." "I won't leave you, but what earthly good am I to you if you won't take my advice?" "Sidonius," he began. "Oh, damn Sidonius. I wish I'd never mentioned him. The whole thing is arrant nonsense, but it's killing you. You've got it on the brain. Don't you know you're a sick man?" "I'm not feeling very grand. It's so warm today. I think I'll lie down." It was no good arguing with him, for he had the appalling obstinacy of very weak things. I went off to my work in a shocking bad temperature. Bad temper. Temperature. The day was what it had promised to be, blisteringly hot. Before midday the sun was hidden by a coppery haze, and there was not the faintest stirring of wind. Duboulay did not appear at luncheon. It was not a meal he ever ate, the butler told me. I slogged away all the afternoon and had pretty well finished my job by 6 o'clock. That would enable me to leave next morning, and I hoped to be able to persuade my host to come with me. The conclusion of my task put me into a better humor, and I went for a walk before dinner. It was a very close evening, for the heat haze had not lifted. The woods were as silent as a grave. Not a bird spoke, and when I came out of the cover to the burnt pastures, the sheep seemed too languid to graze. During my walk I prospected the environs of the house, and saw that it would be very hard to get access to the temple except by a long circuit. On one side was a mass of outbuildings, and then a high wall, and on the other the very closest and highest quick-set hedge I have ever seen, which ended in a wood with savage spikes on its containing wall. I returned to my room, had a cold bath in the exiguous tub, and changed. Duboulay was not at dinner. The butler said that his master was feeling unwell and had gone to bed. The news pleased me, for bed was the best place for him. After that I settled myself down to a lonely evening in the library. I browsed among the shelves and found a number of rare editions which served to pass the time. I noticed that the copy of Sidonius was absent from its place. I think it was about 10 o'clock when I went to bed, for I was unaccountably tired. I remember wondering whether I oughtn't to go and visit Dubélé, but decided that it was better to leave him alone. I still reproach myself for that decision. I know now I ought to have taken him by force and haled him to the inn. Suddenly I came out of heavy sleep with a start. A human cry seemed to be ringing in the corridors of my brain. I held my breath and listened. It came again, a horrid scream of panic and torture. I was out of bed in a second, and only stopped to get my feet into slippers. The cry must have come from the temple. I tore downstairs, expecting to hear the noise of an alarmed household, but there was no sound, and the awful cry was not repeated. The door in the corridor was shut, as I expected. Behind it, pandemonium seemed to be loose, for there was a howling like a tempest, and something more, a crackling like fire. I made for the front door, slipped off the chain, and found myself in the still, moonless night. Still, except for the rending gale that seemed to be raging in the house I had left. From what I had seen on my evening's walk, I knew that my one chance to get to the temple was by way of the quickset hedge. I thought I might manage to force a way between the end of it and the wall. I did it at the cost of much of my raiment and my skin. Beyond was another rough lawn set with tangled shrubberies, and then a precipitous slope to the level of the lake. I scrambled along the sedgy margin, not daring to lift my eyes till I was on the temple steps. The place was brighter than day, with a roaring blast of fire. The very air seemed to be incandescent and to have become a flaming ether. And yet there were no flames, only a burning brightness. I could not enter, for the waft of it struck my face like a scorching hand, and I felt my hair singe. I am short-sighted, as you know, and I may have been mistaken, but this is what I think I saw. From the altar, a great tongue of flame seemed to shoot upwards and lick the roof, and from its pediment ran flaming streams. In front of it lay a body, Dubelé's, a naked body, already charred and black. There was nothing else, except that the Gorgon's head in the wall seemed to glow like a sun in hell. I suppose I must have tried to enter. All I know is that I found myself staggering back, rather badly burned. I covered my eyes, and as I looked through my fingers, I seemed to see the flames flowing under the wall, where there may have been lockers, or possibly another entrance. Then the great oak door suddenly shriveled like gauze, and with a roar the fiery river poured into the house. I ducked myself in the lake to ease the pain, and then ran back as hard as I could by the way I had come. Dubélé, poor devil, was beyond my aid. After that, I'm not very clear what happened. I know that the house burned like a haystack. I found one of the men servants on the lawn, and I think I helped to get the other down from his room by one of the rain pipes. By the time the neighbors arrived, the house was ashes, and I was pretty well mother naked. They took me to the inn and put me to bed, and I remained there till after the inquest. The coroner's jury were puzzled, but they found it simply death by misadventure. A lot of country houses were burned that summer. There was nothing found of Dubélé. Nothing remained of the house, except a few blackened pillars. The altar and the sculptures were so cracked and scarred that no museum wanted them. The place has not been rebuilt, and for all I know, they're there today. I'm not going back to look for them. Nightingale finished his story and looked round his audience. "Don't ask me for an explanation," he said, "for I haven't any. You may believe, if you like, that the god Vaunus inhabited the temple which Dubélé built for him, and when his votary grew scared and tried Sidonius's receipt for shifting the dedication, became angry and slew him with his flaming wind. That wind seemed to have been a perquisite of Vaunus. We know more about him now, for last year they dug up a temple of his in Wales. Lightning, someone suggested. It was a quiet night, with no thunderstorm, said Nightingale. Isn't the countryside volcanic? Peckweather asked. What about pockets of natural gas or something of the kind? Possibly. You may please yourself in your explanation. I'm afraid that I can't help you. All I know is that I don't propose to visit that valley again. What became of your Theocritus? Burned, like everything else. However, that didn't worry me much. 6 weeks later came the war, and I had other things to worry about.